So Maeve, over to you.
Super. Great. Can you all see the slide and not the notes bit?
See the slide perfectly. Thanks,
Wonderful.
Maeve.
Okay. Super. Yeah. So for those who don't know me, I think I've met everybody here, but my name is Maeve. I'm a third-year PhD candidate. Ailish is my supervisor, and also Dr. Caroline Heary in Galway. And my PhD is in collaboration with Jigsaw. So yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about sharing research data or archiving it or open data, all of the different ways it's said. I'm not sure about expertise, as Ailish described. Experience, maybe. Expertise, getting there. But yeah, going to talk a little bit about my experience of preparing data for archiving, and also kind of a little bit about why you should maybe think about sharing your data or some of the practicalities that you might think about. So, sorry, I'm going to move my Zoom over. There we go. So I'm going to discuss kind of the idea of open data generally and the principles that we should aim to work towards, which you've all heard of them. But I want to talk briefly about what they mean in a very practical sense when we think about sharing data. Briefly touch on why you should consider sharing your data, like the wider benefits to the research community and the public, but also the it looks good for you personally as well, benefits which are just as valid. I'm going to briefly explain metadata, mainly because it's something that is frequently mentioned in the same breath as open data or data sharing. And then I'll talk a little bit about how you prepare to share your data and an example of a project that I'm currently working on. So first of all, open data is data that that anyone can access, use, or share. And we live in a world of open data. So if you checked a map today, looked at the weather, bus time, traffic update, COVID-19 numbers, how many seats are in the library, all of those are examples of open data. So data collected for one purpose that can be accessed by many people and used for lots of different purposes. So while completely open data is the ultimate goal and the gold standard, in research it isn't always possible. So what we should aim for is to have our data as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And some researchers argue that that shouldn't just be an aim, but it's also maybe an obligation as well as researchers. So there are several sets of principles, frameworks, many acronyms around data sharing, and the most common one of those is FAIR, which was originally developed in 2016, and it was designed to improve the sharing of digital resources. I'm sure you've heard of the FAIR data principles. You may even, like me, have written in a funding application that your data would indeed be FAIR data, perhaps without any kind of practical understanding of what that might actually mean. So if your data is FAIR, it is first of all findable. So other researchers should be able to find it very easily without having to email you personally. It should have a DOI or a URL, and it should have good metadata. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about metadata later, but metadata are meant to be machine readable, which is what will bring up your data when someone goes looking. So if someone searches young people, mental health, your metadata will make your data appear as opposed to somebody else's. Your data should also be accessible. Now, FAIR data is not the same as open data. Your data can be FAIR and not completely open access, but it should have a license that explains what can and can't be done with it and who can't access it. And if it's not open access, then how researchers can access it should be really, really clear. It should also be interoperable, which generally refers to using information on a computer system. So in that sense, the interoperability of your data basically means that it's usable on other computer systems and that researchers can integrate it with other data. A really good example I saw to explain this was someone accessed data that had been set up in Microsoft Access, which no one really uses anymore, and indeed that person couldn't use the data. And you never know, in the future, saving your data in SPSS format might render it uninteroperable, which I don't think is a word. And then your data should also be reusable, which I think is kind of self-explanatory. It should be easy to understand. The documentation you provide with your data should be enough, and researchers should be able to use your data to either replicate your findings or do their own research. So thinking then about why you should think about sharing your data, there's loads of benefits. I'm sure you could come up with this list yourself as well. But sharing data can advance our understanding of different phenomena. In our case, our understanding of youth mental health. And it can accelerate the pace of that understanding as we're not collecting and recollecting data that maybe already exists somewhere else. In that way, it's more efficient and it's cheaper. Now, it's not cheaper or time efficient for you, the archiver, but it saves time and money for the future researchers archiving it, and we'll go back to that a little bit later. It also guards against research fraud, as results can be validated, and thus it builds the public's trust. Sharing data also builds people's trust in terms of like research participation as well, because you're making the most of their time and that their experience will continue to increase understanding after your particular paper has been published. Adding further to understanding, sharing research can also impact policy formation. So where data from multiple sources can be brought together to lead to policy change, where maybe one data set alone can't do that. And finally, sharing your data preserves it long term. Again, that's also making the most of participants' time, but it's also allowing researchers well in the future an insight into youth mental health at this particular moment in time. And just to sidetrack briefly, when I think about the benefit of open data or data sharing, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has been an excellent example of this. And my original intention here was to have a single sentence just being like, look how much we benefited from data sharing in the last 2 years, public benefit, etc. But then when I actually started looking into it, the pandemic has been a really good example of both the good that data sharing can bring and the harm that not sharing data can also do. So during the pandemic, there has been a lot of data shared and a lot of collaboration between researchers, which is really amazing. In particular, there's been a lot of data sharing about how the virus spreads and the speed of spread. And those are just 2 data banks, if you're interested. I was kind of fascinated, where researchers can both deposit and access data immediately about COVID genome sequencing and about protein. I also found a really interesting article about how geospatial data has been used during the pandemic, but that's a sidebar to an already a sidebar. In terms of data being shared alongside published papers, a systematic review found that 28.5% of 12,324 papers on COVID-19 on PubMed provided at least one dataset link, which is not a terrible number. It's not amazing, but it's not a terrible number. However, that same systematic review said that there was a lot of heterogeneity in how data sets were shared, so not very findable if we think about the FAIR principles. Also, there's been a lot of papers shared without data, which means the data can't be verified. And building on that, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the US said that they had researchers pulling data from papers, which was very time consuming and labor intensive, when it would have been just much easier to have the actual data set in front of them. Similarly, a lot of COVID-19 data was shared without metadata, which means the data are really, really hard to reuse because you have to waste time getting the data into a place where you can understand them. There's also a lot of data shared on some things, and then on other things in the pandemic, no data has been shared. In the first 4 months of the pandemic, over 19 articles were shared on COVID, and a lot of these were preprints, which is both a blessing and a curse. It meant that knowledge was shared really quickly, but preprints are not peer-reviewed and they're published without their data. And this led to a lot of misinformation being spread and also direct harm being done to the public in terms of what drugs can be used to treat COVID-19 in hospitals. And then a survey was done in 2021 that found that only 17.3% of COVID trials were open to sharing the data. And then kind of the biggest sort of scandal was that there was papers retracted from the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine because there was inconsistencies found and the authors refused to share the data either with the public or even with an auditor, so that nothing could be verified, and it was concluded that the data had been falsified. And then there's also some claims that there was a lot of wasteful research done in the pandemic, small trials or repeat trials where if people had just shared data from bigger trials, you wouldn't have had to do those kind of smaller ones. I did put a question mark beside that because I think calling it wasteful is really unfair to participants, but I do take the point. So as I said, I think the pandemic really kind of hammered home the point to me anyway about like the importance of sharing data and the public benefit of it. It is a very dramatic example though. So aside from those kind of big dramatic public benefits of data sharing, there's also benefits to you personally as the researcher, and there are also very, very valid reasons to think about sharing your data. So first of all, it increases visibility around your work through citations and downloads of your data. You get your name out there more. Having an archive data set is a publication. It's a section on your CV. It's on your LinkedIn. A study of trials in cancer research found that studies where the data had been made available had a higher number of citations than ones where the data was not shared, and that was independent of whatever journal they'd chosen or the impact factor of the journal. So you might get more citations on your papers as well. It can also lead to more collaboration opportunities with other researchers doing similar work to you. It also lends you some credibility, kind of similar to registering your study prior to carrying it out. You're saying, look, I did a thing, I have nothing to hide, unlike some COVID-19 researchers I could mention. And then also your data is very secure. It's safe on secure servers. So if your laptop or hard drive spontaneously combusts, your data is somewhere safe. Okay, and then I just thought this was quite interesting. Wiley has done a number of surveys about data sharing and researcher motivations to share data. And I thought it was interesting that over time, public benefit and transparency have become more important to researchers than the fact that it's just something you do because a journal says you have to. I thought that was quite interesting, and apologies for the quality of the second image. That's Wiley's fault and not mine. Okay, and then when I first went looking up reasons why you shouldn't share data, I kept coming across papers and articles where people shared arguments, or there was reasons why people hesitate to share data, and then the arguments against those hesitations. So I put in the top ones here, but there are loads more and loads of other solutions. So I've mentioned papers at the bottom there. If the reason why you're hesitating isn't here, it might be in one of those papers with the solution. So first of all, people worry about participant confidentiality, but this can be mitigated through planning from the beginning, good data management, and anonymization procedures. Secondly, people worry that their idea or their findings or their data might be scooped. However, you can place an embargo on your data. For example, I was in touch with the repository that I'm going to archive with, and they said that I can send the data whenever, and they'll just hold off on publishing it until I tell them to do so. And then people might be worried that future researchers might misuse or misinterpret their data. And this can be mitigated through really good documentation and very rich metadata, and also through consulting with researchers who are going to use your data, so providing your contact details and encouraging that. And then also, if you're really worried about it, using a repository that isn't entirely open access, so that only accredited researchers can access the data. And then some people argue, and I mentioned this earlier, that they don't have the resources to kind of dedicate to this. While it saves future researchers time and money, it doesn't really save you time or money. However, this it requires a kind of a shift in mindset and making data sharing part of the research process, that it's not just something extra you do at the end, that it's part of the whole process, it's an obligation. And then also people worry that future researchers won't credit them properly. I mean, there's very little you can do here, but that's kind of the risk with everything that you publish and put out into the world. And it does kind of require a change in, research or academic culture. But also you can think about maybe depositing it somewhere careful, maybe not somewhere entirely open access, so people have to at least apply to access your data. And then there are some legitimate reasons for not publishing your data, and these are from the European Commission. So if you have commercially sensitive data, or if you have an arrangement with a commercial partner who might be sponsoring the research project, if there's security issues or privacy issues that you absolutely can't get around, if publishing your data means you won't make your aim, and then if you're not collecting any data. Those last two I hesitated to put in, like the European Commission has listed them. I felt they were a little bit obvious, but they have them listed, so I put them in. Okay, and then metadata, which is interesting. So on the side there, you'll see a screenshot from my data set. And imagine if I gave you this and I was like, here's your data, enjoy, go forth. That is data without metadata. You could probably figure it out, assuming that maybe my variable labels and my values in SPSS are really clear, but it would take you a long time. And there's some things you wouldn't be able to figure out, maybe about data collection and things like that. And trying to figure it out and make the data usable would just be a massive waste of your time. Like, why are you doing that? I should have given you information to make you understand the data. And as I mentioned earlier, during the pandemic, there were cases where data was shared among researchers, but without metadata, which is just really time consuming and then labor intensive to then prepare the data for use. So data or metadata, and have you given a presentation unless there's an iceberg picture in it somewhere? Metadata is just data about data, or more specifically, it's a subset of data documentation that provides standardized, structured information explaining the purpose, origin, time references, geographical location, creating author, access conditions, and terms of use of the data collection. The standardized and structured part is what makes metadata machine readable, and it makes it searchable, and it makes it easy to move around. And that standardization and structure comes from international standards or schemas. These are sometimes generic, or they're sometimes for a particular discipline or a particular type of research. So these are two types of metadata standards. So the Dublin core is a more generic one. There isn't that many like categories in it. And then fortunately that's Dublin in Ohio and not Dublin in Ireland. And then the DDI is a lot more detailed. There's a lot more categories in it, and that's used for survey research. So a couple of months ago, I went down a very deep, dark and confusing rabbit hole of trying to comprehend metadata, but you don't need to do that. I'm saving you from that now. You only need to have really a surface level understanding of metadata, enough to know that different repositories will conform to different standards. Then you give them the information and they put it into the system, and you carry on with your life. The more information you give, and by information I mean the contextual information about your data, the richer your metadata is, and the easier it is for future researchers to understand your data, like how the data was collected, where was it collected, who were the participants, that kind of thing. And that's it. You just give them information, they put it into the standard, your data has metadata, people can now look it up. Okay, so as a researcher, it's very helpful to consider the aspects of data management that apply to the different stages of your research project. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I think data management is a talk all in itself, and the library has so many wonderful resources that I can't even do justice to. So I'm not going to go too much into data management, but I wanted to highlight some points in the process that you might want to think about if you're planning to share your data. So when you're getting ethical approval, you have to include that you're going to archive your data afterwards. When you're getting consent, you have to tell the participants what you're going to do with the data. And that paper I've mentioned on the bottom has some really interesting and kind of practical tips about the ethics and consent stages. Just things like avoiding promising you'll destroy data. That's not really ethical anymore, and being very clear with participants about what's going to happen to their information afterwards. And then when you're actually going to archive the data, you need to prepare the documentation, choose a repository, maybe not necessarily in that order. And I'm going to come back to the documentation in a little bit, but first on the choosing of a repository, here are lots of links, and I will make the slides available so you can explore them. These are by no means, this is like not an exhaustive list in any of those categories. The first section are just like more lists of repositories for different domains, or who like, for example, the Wellcome Trust like approve these ones, etc. Whereas say this one is just a huge bank of repositories. These are the kind of more general ones for any discipline. You could also include like the Open Science Framework in that list. And then Irish specific, we've got the ISSDA and the IQDA. But again, not an exhaustive list. Okay, so the data that I'm currently working on archiving is for this project. This data came from a cross-sectional survey that centered around two measures, one for teacher confidence to deliver mental health content, and then teacher worries about addressing mental health in the classroom. So it included 644 secondary school staff in Ireland. There was demographic questions, 6 measures. There was 4 open questions, 3 of them being the If yes, please specify variety, and then one bigger one, which amounted to 81 variables in the data set. And we aim to deposit the data with the Irish Social Science Data Archive. Okay, so these are some of the actions that were taken throughout the process to prepare for data sharing. So at the beginning, we indicated that the data will be archived in the ethics application form, and I'm sure you all know that part of the UCD ethics form. Then in the consent form, we clearly told participants what would happen to their data, and that's just a little kind of piece that we had in there about that. You'll notice there that I've only mentioned that accredited researchers would be accessing it, which means then we can't license the data for, say, teaching purposes, which is maybe a shame, but I have to go with what we obviously told the participants what would happen. And just to say that that article that I mentioned earlier about the tips for ethical data sharing, they have a really interesting piece around if you didn't tell participants what was going to happen. Like if you didn't tell them it would be destroyed, if you didn't tell them it was sharing, if you were just silent on the matter, like what are your options there? So if that is the case, that paper has some interesting tips on that. And then when setting up the survey, I kept a record of all the changes that were made to the measures, obviously as you would do. When I was cleaning the data, I tried to make it as clear as possible in terms of like the labels and the values and things like that. I basically imagined handing the data set to an undergrad stats class and seeing if they would understand it, and I thought they would. So yeah, just make it as clear as possible. I kept a record, possibly too detailed, of every change I made so that it could be reversed. And then I also made a master copy of the dataset. There are multiple copies of it. So this is just a screenshot of the folder on my computer. This is the actual dataset. That's the qualitative part pulled out in Excel. So this dataset I can open, I can copy from here. But if I accidentally save a change to that, like measure total scores or something, then there is another copy of that data in the don't touch folder, which is for emergencies only. And it's just a glimpse inside how my brain works. Then I completed a data dictionary according to the ISSDA suggestions, which we'll look at in a minute. I did the data depositor form for the ISSDA, which is where the metadata comes from. And I prepared a PDF of the survey and the consent form. And then there was a couple of things that I wasn't sure about in the depositor form. So I got in touch with the data manager in the ISSDA, and he was very nice. And he said, if anyone else is planning to deposit data, to get in touch. So this is what the data dictionary looks like when I prepared it, and I can show you the full Word document if you're interested. And it's currently being checked by the ISSDA, but at first glance, they said it looked fine. If it turns out that something is wrong in it, I will of course let you all know, but for the moment they've said it's fine. So this, as I said, is a full Word document. It starts with the variable number, which is the number that corresponds in SPSS when you're looking at variable view. The variable name, which is the same as SPSS, the variable label. I chose to make the variable label the same as the question because I felt like that was the clearest thing. You may not do that, but I felt like that was very clear. And then the ISSDA recommended that you include the wording that you used in the survey in the data dictionary. Now, because my label is also the question, this makes this a little bit repetitive, but if your label was different to the question, having the wording there as well would be really useful for future researchers. And then we've got the code and the meaning, which is just the values assigned in SPSS. So this is just an example of a demographic variable and what it looks like in the data dictionary. So it's number 23 down in the variable view, it's number 23 across in the data view in SPSS. And then this is one of the, an item from one of the measures. And so in this one here, only 2 of the responses have a value assigned. It's just a peculiarity of this particular measure. And then this one is an example from another measure where there was recoding done, and I wanted to make that really clear to future researchers, because if they looked at the survey, they would see that participants had a don't know and not applicable, but then if they go to the data, there are no don't knows and not applicables, because don't know has been recoded as 3 according to the original author's specifications, and not applicable was recoded as missing. So I just wanted to make that abundantly clear to anyone who accesses the data. And then also in the data dictionary, I included footnotes for variables that might need explaining, especially if someone was accessing this and they weren't familiar with the Irish education context. So for example, youth reach, I just have a footnote to explain that to them, and also DESH, a footnote to explain that. And there's also a section in the data dictionary about anonymization. Depending on your type of data, this might be a really big section. For us, this section was really small because there was only one thing that needed to be anonymized, because we didn't collect any data that was in any way identifiable, but someone in the open question gave their email address and they misread the question. So that has been taken out. So I'm just letting future researchers know that that was what was done. Again, this section might be much bigger depending on what kind of data you have collected. And then also in the data dictionary document, I have details of the measures that were used. Now, this wasn't asked for by the ISSDA, but I felt it was necessary, because if I accessed a data set, I would want to know what the measures were, if the authors had changed anything from the original authors. So that's why I decided to include it. So this is for the teacher confidence measure. So it's just the measure name, who the original authors were, the variable numbers within the data set, the variable names in the data set, what it measures, if we changed anything, how it's scored, and if we recoded anything. And this is just an example of one, the stigma scale that was in the study. That's just a bit longer because there was a lot of modifications to the measure, both in terms of how the data will appear, because there are extra items and a response option added, but also in how it appeared to the participants, because we altered the instructions around the measure just very, very slightly. So all of that is included there. And then also the recoding. So they'll see the recoding in the dictionary part, but they'll also see the recoding here. Just again, trying to make it very clear to them. Okay, and then the depositor form for the ISSDA anyway, this was really, really easy. They don't ask about anything that you do not already know about your own data set. So this is just an example page out of it. They ask about when the data was collected, how the data was collected, where the data was collected. And this is what makes your metadata. So if someone comes looking for a study of school staff in Dublin, my metadata will tell them to go elsewhere, because my metadata will say that it was all of Ireland. Okay, so when I'm sending things to the ISSDA, which I will be doing any day now, this is what I'm sending. So the depositor form, the data dictionary and code book, which is quite long, the consent form, and the data manager, when I met with him, he said it was really good that we were including the consent form, because it's something that people who access data often ask about, and it's something that depositors often don't include. I don't know why, so include a consent form. The survey, obviously the data itself, and then the license agreement, which I haven't completed yet, but it's on my list. And that is where you kind of indicate that this data can be used it can be used for future research. It can or can't be used for teaching, or vice versa. Okay, so in conclusion, we should aim to have our data as open as possible, as close as necessary, and in line with fair data principles. There's a lot of benefits to sharing your data, both for you personally, to the research community, and the wider public. Sharing data is not something you can do at the end, just you're like, oh, I think I'd like to share it. It has to start early with a lot of planning, but it's not hard, it's not intimidating, it's actually very, very simple if you have planned throughout the stages of the research project. And the library has lots of excellent resources, both on data management and on archiving or sharing data. I've shared some articles here of the things that I read to put this together, but also I know there's a YouTube video in there somewhere on metadata if you're interested in joining me down the rabbit hole. And that is all. Thank you so much, and happy to take any questions.